This time, it's going to be a conversation between Chisholm and Rahwa. I will ask them questions. At the beginning, Chisholm will give us a presentation on what is racism and anti-racism. And then I will ask them questions, and both of them will answer the questions and have a little conversation about them. What I would like to say is that in February in US is observed as a Black History Month or African American History Month. It started as a week in 1915 and turned into a month in the 1960s. And the purpose is to honor and elevate the achievements and contributions of Black people and African Americans in the US. Also in the UK, LGBTQIA plus History Month is observed with the same purpose. So celebrating these histories, we can also ask ourselves and consider how we can be active allies to marginalized groups. And I'm sure that the topic and conversation we are facilitating with our amazing guests today will contribute to these considerations. So, okay, I would like to introduce myself and then ask the speakers to introduce themselves. My name is Eva. I'm the program director at Diversify. I have a light white skin, brown eyes, brownish blonde hair. I'm wearing bright green sweater and my background is green. That kind of leaves behind me. Now I would like to invite Chisholm to introduce herself and then Rahwa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chisholm Daisy. I am an economist and diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging strategist, enthusiast, consultant. I think I do a pretty bad job at introducing myself in general, but I'm happy to be here, happy to have this conversation. Today, I am sitting, as usual, I think, behind a plain off-whitish wall. I'm wearing a off-white beret on my head. I have my hair in twists, and I am wearing a colorful sweater for once. So I am a Black woman, and yeah, I guess that's what I can think about for today. Rahwa?
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm also very, very bad at introducing myself, and I don't like it, but I'll try. Well, I did say my name, right? Rahwa Talahuni Hannes. I am the founder of Manifold. I'm an activist, an Afrofeminist. I'm wearing braids, black sweater as usual. My background is a white wall with two partial photographs of parks. And I'm brown. I am from Ethiopia.
Thank you both. So we will start, as I said, with Chisholm giving us a short presentation. But before we start with the presentation, we would like to do a poll. So Miguel, can you give us a first question? And I invite everyone to. It's totally anonymous. Nobody will know your answers. It's just interesting to see and to kind of warm us up into this discussion. Okay. So first question: do you think you are a racist?
Okay, I think 100% of people have answered, right? Or no? I can't vote, but it's nice to see like the polls going. Like, yeah.
Mm. Okay. Okay.
So here we have about 47% of attendees say no. We have about 36% saying I don't know. And then we have about 17% saying yes. Okay.
Okay. The second question, no, sorry. We're still on the question
Share
one.
results, right?
Share results. Okay. I was like, what? Do you think you are anti-racist?
I guess for those online as well, watching on LinkedIn, you're not able to participate in this. We're just waiting for the polls to come in. Okay.
So yes, and I don't know are very close.
Yes. So we have about 49% at I don't know, about 49% at yes, and 6% as no. Thank you all for sharing. It's really interesting to see how we introspect and see ourselves within these conversations that we have.
Yes. Okay. I guess Chisholm, you can start sharing screen and give us your presentation.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to close my screen here. All right. So the goal today is Rahul and I, Eva's going to ask us questions, and Rahul and I will answer these questions through a conversational style, and hopefully structured enough. But we thought it was very important to create kind of like a foundation of what we're talking about. So just to define for ourselves, what is racism, because we do understand that people have different understanding of what racism is, and then what is anti-racism, because we also understand that people have different understanding of what that is. So for that purposes, which I'm just going to jump into a small presentation that we put together very quickly to create a definition. Okay, let's see. I'm just going to present. Can everyone see my screen okay? All right. So of course, today we're here talking about anti-racism within our diversity and inclusion in the workplace programming. This is Rahul and myself. We've already introduced ourselves, so I'm going to skip through that. So what is racism? According to Henry and Tato, it is a system in which one group of people exercises power over another on the basis of their skin color. So it is an implicit or explicit set of beliefs, erroneous assumptions, and actions based on an ideology of the inherent superiority of one racial group over the other. And it is evident in organizational or institutional structure and programs, as well as individual thoughts or behavioral patterns. Now, this is very academic, and we're going to try to break it down over the next couple of slides. So one of the ways we might think about racism is that we can think about racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or a group of people based on their membership to a racial or ethnic group. And typically these are people who are in racialized, minoritized, or marginalized groups. It's really important to understand the different forms in which racism exists. So some of the ones that we might know of is when it's structural. So we're thinking about like the institutional and systemic form of racism. And of course, there's also the interpersonal and individual form of racism. From an from a systemic perspective, we're really looking at laws, policies, cultural representation, and societal norms that often work together to deny opportunity. When we think about it from an institutional perspective as well, we think about how it shows up in organizations and includes discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, and biased practices that hinges on race, that results in inequitable outcomes, in many cases for white people over people of color. And it does extend beyond prejudice. Okay, so one of the most prominent anti-racists in the world, as we know it today, is Ibram Kendi. And Ibram Kendi defines racism as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. So basically, we might think of racism as what happens when racial prejudice meets power, right? And we're going to nuance racial prejudice and power as well. So what is racial prejudice? Racism is very different from racial prejudice. And I think it's really important that we understand this, right? So for example, any one of us, black, white, purple, orange, can have racial prejudice, but not all of us have power. So when we think about racial prejudice, we think about how it connects to power, in that racism involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through policies and practices by shaping societal beliefs, cultural beliefs, institutional beliefs that inadvertently affect everyone. So one of the ways we think about racial prejudice is a set of discriminatory attitudes that is often based on false assumptions derived from perceptions about race and skin color. Again, highlighting the fact here that racism is what happens when racial prejudice meets power. Okay, so where does racial prejudice comes from? I think it is historical in nature, and we can find it in the European imperialism, in history of colonialism, in Eurocentric ideas of what fits, what is good, what is not, what is ideal and what is not. And these ideals are based on hierarchy, which were used to justify that one group is inferior or superior than the other. And in the world today, even though this has deep in historical context, we still live in a world that continues to privilege people who are higher up on that hierarchy that was constructed. So basically people who fit into what the ideal is. So again, racial prejudice, we think of it as an expression of prejudice, be it in words or in action. And it always originates from a point along the hierarchy that has been created. And it's usually directed at someone located elsewhere on that hierarchy. So it's really important to note here that whether you appear non-white, so if you're a racialized person, if you're a Black person, if you're an indigenous person, if you're a person of color, it does not automatically mean that you are non-racist or that you are unable to have racial prejudices. You absolutely are able to have racial prejudice, even if you're not white. So quickly, let's talk about power. So power is the ability to influence others and the ability to define reality for yourself and for others. And I think that's a really important aspect to understand and try to grasp. You know, it's also important that we understand that power is relational and it's fluid. You know, different relationships can either reinforce or disrupt one another. Power is important to anti-racism work because racism can only be fully understood when we acknowledge that power is not only an individual relationship, but also a cultural one. and that power relationships are constantly shifting. So we can use our power in a way that is harmful or hateful and intentional, but it doesn't have to be so. We can also use it in solidarity with groups and in rooms where we have more power. And it's also important to note that you might benefit from systemic structures that power has built without even being aware of it. So what is anti-racism, which is a topic that we're trying to unpack today, Ro and I? Ibram Kendi again says, no one becomes not racist, despite a tendency to identify that way. We can only strive to be anti-racist on a daily basis to continually rededicate ourselves to the lifelong task of overcoming our racist heritage. So we do not get a cookie for being self-described not racist. A racist is somebody who upholds and benefits from a racist policy through their action and inaction. I think it's important we also grasp that sometimes we think, well, if I'm not committing a racist act, it means I'm not racist. But if you're witnessing a racist act and you're doing nothing about this, what you have to ask yourself, what does that make you? Does that make you a non-racist? Does that make you an anti-racist? Or does that make you a racist? So anti-racism is a process of actively identifying and opposing racism. The goal of anti-racism is to challenge racism and actively change the policies, the behaviors, and the beliefs that perpetuate racist ideas and actions. An anti-racist is somebody who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So this is the last slide for today, and Rahul and I are going to jump into this conversation and see the questions Eva has for us. But one of the ways to look at how to become an anti-racist, this is a really good diagram put together by Andrew Ibrahim. And we see the fear zone, right? This is where I think most of us start in our journey. You know, where we're still in the fear zone, we think, you deny that racism is a problem. You know, I avoid the hard questions because it's uncomfortable and I really want to be comfortable. And you only generally talk to others who look and think like you. When you're in the learning zone of how to become an anti-racist, you actively start to recognize that racism is a present and current problem. You seek out questions that make you uncomfortable. You understand your own privilege in ignoring racism. You educate yourself about race and structural racism. You are vulnerable about your own biases and you do acknowledge the gaps therein. You listen to others who look and think differently from you. And when you're in the growth zone, you actively identify that you may unknowingly benefit from racism. You promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. You sit with the discomfort. You speak out when you see racism in action. You educate your peers about how racism works in your field, in your industry, at your workplace. You don't let mistakes deter you from being better, because oftentimes, you know, like we make a mistake and say we're called out or called in and we think, oh, I'm never going to get it right. Why bother? You know, like you push past that feeling of like, oh, okay, I made a mistake. I'm here to learn because this is an ongoing journey. You yield power of positions to those otherwise marginalized. You don't take up space where you can highlight and champion other people. And you also surround yourself with others who think and look differently from you. According to Angela Davis, in a racist society, it's not enough to be not racist. We must be anti-racist. And now we are going to jump on the panel discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Chisholm. That was amazing. I am mindful of the time, so I want to jump in immediately because I know there's so much to unpack here and I'm so excited about it. So, ladies, first question. What are some of the challenges with discussing or addressing racism?
I think you need to jump in there. I need to catch
yeah,
my breath.
sure thing. Well, I mean, think about the presentation that Chisholm just had and think about how deeply ingrained it is in our society. I mean, racism is so well systematized that it works on an international relations level, it works within nations, and it works on an interpersonal level. And if you don't understand how it impacts people's lives, then you don't really understand racism. It's not just, somebody experiencing something like somebody being called a racial slur, which is a very bad thing, but it's not just that, it's so much bigger than that. But often, as we probably will discuss later on, there are so many levels to what people experience that unless we understand how it deeply impacts different groups of people, including, by the way, white people as well, and those that are more privileged, how it impacts our lives, then you're not really having a proper conversation about it. So the imagination that one is inherently better than the other, it's, ties to creating a hierarchy of systems where people are placed on different levels, in which Black people are at the very bottom. And that's due to, how colonialism has built that hierarchy where people think that they're better than others, but then at the same time try to come as close to whiteness as possible. But I'll get into whiteness later. I'm not going to say much about this one.
And if I could add to that, I think that the challenge with discussing racism is that it tends to make people feel defensive. I think people tend to get the feeling that they are in some way responsible for the actions and beliefs of their ancestors, their neighbors, their country, their ethnic, cultural or racial group, that they have to bear this burden. I think with this challenge, people tend to inadvertently experience feelings of guilt, shame, and blame, and sometimes they choose not to engage. And for those who choose to engage, they might get defensive or feel a need to assert that they don't see color, or like the normal color blindness. And I do want to say color blindness is an ableist term, so we should move away from that anyways. I think that some of us think that because we don't see, for those of us who think that we don't have racial prejudice, that we don't have racial prejudice on the basis of, say, being married to a person of a different color or race, or having kids that have different colors or race, being best friends or family members from people who come from a racialized group or minoritized group, or not having any conscious discriminatory attitudes towards people who are ordered, and I think that they feel that this invalidates or this validates, their inability to see color. And I think that for those who are both on the defensive and the receiving end, these conversations on both sides can lead to frustration, it can lead to anger, and it's very exhausting. So I think the first step in having a conversation about race is that to admit that we all, and I mean each and every one of us, including myself, we see race, we see color, and we ascribe some type of meaning to it, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And this fact does not mean we're racist. To solve a problem, we really need to acknowledge that it exists. What we need to understand is that it is really only by openly talking about race, racism, racial prejudice, and the harmful effect and the stereotypes that come from it and the assumptions that come from it, that we can actually make it go away. Not talking about it is not going to make it disappear, right? I also think that discussing and addressing racism is difficult because people don't really understand the gravity of race, in that it shows up in systemic, structural, societal, cultural, and interpersonal layers. And in most forms, if not all forms, it is extremely violent. I think in addressing racism, like in addressing any forms of discrimination, we have to first compartmentalize it to properly understand it. And then we have to account for it within and across intersectional lines, so trying to round up here, but we really want to say that so often we talk about racism. When we talk about racism, it quickly becomes like an oppression Olympics. People say, but I struggle too. I grew up poor. I have a disability. So let me be clear. being othered is not mutually exclusive from racism. You can be gay, autistic, disabled, a trans person, and still be racist, right? On oppression of Olympics, I think it's really important to understand the role that race plays in systemic inequities, you know, that irrespective of the different intersectional identities we have, or the race that, or the wealth, for example, that we have, that race can still negatively favor one group over the other. So if we take healthcare in the United States, for example, Black women are among the most educated groups of people. Like, I think according to research done by the National Center for Educational Statistics between 2009 and 2010, I believe, Black women accounted for 68% of like associate degrees, 66% of bachelor degrees, and I believe 71% of master's degree, and also 65% of doctorate degrees. So if we look that from a socio-economic and education perspective, that Black women are privileged, why is it that rich Black women are more likely to die while giving birth to children than poor white women, right? So I think to quantify this within a health framework, African-American women are 3.2 times likely to die during childbirth than white women, right? For every 1,000 births, 40.8 African-American women die in comparison to 12.7 white women dying within the healthcare system. And when we look at Native or Indigenous women, they are 2.5 times more likely to die during labor than white women. So we also have to look at inequities within like systemic structures like this. So I think I'm going to stop there for now.
If I can add one thing in terms of the systemic structures, there's also a huge issue of erasure of history. And we don't know how to acknowledge, the past. And without acknowledging the past, I don't think we can really talk about the present. Because one of our biggest issues, for example, here in Norway, is that whenever you talk about racism, the first thing that people say is, yeah, but Norway is not racist. We don't have history of racism. We don't have history of slavery. We do. The only thing is that we have erased that history. Well, it's not really erased. If you go look for it, you'll find it, but it's not in the curriculum where everyone has access to it, that everyone knows about it. Well, the first slave ship was made by Norwegians. It was Norwegian. Denmark, Norway had colonies in the West Indies. We've had a so-called zoo in Norway where Black people were displayed as if they were animals. And I'm not going to keep going, but like also if you think about what the Norwegian system has done to Indigenous peoples and continues to do the Indigenous people of Norway, I think we have more than plenty of racism in Norway to be able to address it. And, and that's aside from everything that people of color or people of a global majority experience on a daily basis. So I'm going to stop here so that we can move on to the next questions. We're going to get into a lot of it anyway.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Rahwa, that you said this global majority. I know Chisholm uses it also. I love the phrase, and it's a truth phrase, and I think it's going to, go into use more and more. Okay, let's go further. No, wait a minute. We're talking about spaces now. In which spaces and in what forms can racism occur?
I think racism occurs in different spaces. In a lot of spaces, I think oftentimes when we think about racism, we think about it because it's become such a white versus Black thing. We think it only happens like in white spaces, but it happens in spaces with people of the global majority. So basically everybody else who's non-white. So BIPOC, for example, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It also shows up in purely Black spaces as well in different forms. It shows up as forms of anti-Blackness. So for example, in white spaces, it could show up severely within systemic structures in the workplace, for example, who gets promoted, or maybe like microaggressions, like which hair is considered professional, or clean or acceptable. It can show up in friendly jokes. I get a lot of those from my friends, that is unintentional and it's well-meaning, but it's harmful. In BIPOC and in global majority spaces, like it shows up through proximity to whiteness, and also shows up through like different ethnic layers, who is considered to be better than. I think this ties in quite well with anti-Blackness, where if there is a hierarchy, then Black people are like at the bottom, and then just the way up to whiteness. I think that manifests in how racism can show up also in Black spaces. And I think this is also why, like in Black spaces, you see, or in Black countries where you see where people bleach their skin, because the lighter you are, the more beautiful you are perceived to be, the more status you're perceived to have. And we can go further into this. I know Rawa has quite a bit to say here, but basically just saying that different forms of racism show up in different layers. And while they have different layers of harm, it's still kind of like the root cause is based on racism and colonialism and these Eurocentric ideas. Rawa, what do you think?
Well, I'll add to that the matter of power. And when we talk about power, I'm not only talking about power of those who are at the, I don't like this hierarchical system, but I mean, I think that's what people understand the most. So I'm going to say those that are at the top of that hierarchy, which is white, and those that are usually, when we talk about racism, we're talking white-Black issue. And just think about it. And I'm going to try and put this in a perspective that people understand. White and Black, two opposites at two very different ends. And then there's a whole lot spectrum there of different colors, when really Black people are not Black. Yes, there are some that actually are Black, but most and a lot of people are brown, but everyone is called Black by the construction of race. And what I'm trying to get at is that, like, when you talk about power, there is social upwards mobility. And when we talk about that, then you have a lot of people in them, like you talked about the educated women in America are Blacks, most educated women. But sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. I'm a little bit all over the place. You have social upwards mobility, but because of the opportunities that you don't get because of the color of your skin or how you're perceived, you don't really get that social upwards mobility. And most of the people within the global majority that have that type of social upwards mobility are people of color that are not Black, usually East Asians and Southern Asians. And in that, that's in between people of color can be racist and have racial prejudice towards Black people. And that's what we call anti-Blackness. It's not just, of course, anti-Black racism. And that can very much occur in exclusively non-white spaces. And that system of oppression based on race is, it can be committed by anyone that has more power than the other. I can't really think of anything right now, so I'm just
maybe it's also worth saying, Rahwa, that like power is accumulated based on like a lot of diversity parameters. So you can get power on the basis of your religion, you can have power on the basis of your job, on the basis of beauty, on the basis of the environment you grew up in, the school you went to, the type of like jobs you have. So I think like just understanding that the layers of privilege are added based on demographic information of people and how that allows you to climb up that hierarchy, for lack of a better word. So yeah, Eva.
Okay. Thank you, ladies. Let's move on. So, can anybody be a racist? What do you say about that?
No.
And I and I know a lot of people are wondering too. No? Okay.
To be a racist, you need, well, once again, we'll go back to power, right? Part of racism is power plus racial prejudice. And unless you have that power backing you, how are you going to be racist? Because racism is so much bigger than just having racial prejudice. You have to actually be able to exert some sort of power to discriminate or hurt or marginalize a group of people. And in that case, I think that no, you can't, not just anybody can be racist. And I'm not saying that people of color cannot be racist, because I just said that racism can occur within global majority spaces. But I am of the personal opinion that as Black people, when you look at it from a power perspective, you can't be racist. You can have racial prejudice, but you cannot be racist.
And I agree with that, Ro. I guess if I can nuance it a bit more, I think it depends on how we define racism or who a racist is. And I think this is why it's so important to have a clear definition, at least for yourself, on what racism is or who a potential racist could be, because people have different understanding of what it is. So as you said, Roha, anyone can have racial prejudice, absolutely. So if we're looking at it from the perspective of, say, Black people, some Black people absolutely have racial prejudice, but if we define racism in its systemic form, and this includes racial prejudice and power, and as a result, it is a system of group privilege by those who have an unequal share of society's power, prestige, property, privilege, then yeah, the answer is no. Black people on the systemic definition of racism cannot be racist. Again, to be clear, it is my opinion that Black people can have racial prejudice. I know a few, right? However, collectively, Black people are neither the primary creators or beneficiaries of racism in the world as it exists today. So that would be my reasoning for why not everyone can necessarily be racist. If we think about it from the position of what happens when racial prejudice and power meets. But can Black people have racial prejudice? Absolutely.
Can we contribute to racism? Yes, we just don't benefit from it.
Okay, that is super interesting. Let's go further. Okay, is there a factual basis for reverse racism? And what is actually reverse racism, if you can also explain?
No, and if there is no factual basis, it doesn't exist. I just said this thing. I mean, if you don't have, like I said, right, like usually reverse racism is referred to white people experiencing racism. And once again, I'm just going to go ahead and say racial prejudice. Yes, Chisom just said that Black people can have racial prejudice against other people. But when it comes down to it, when we're talking about power, and I'll keep saying power throughout this entire panel, and it's because power is very much the main ingredient of racism as a system. I just added some notes here, yeah. In terms of racism as an institutional and structural and systemic practice, you can't exert that type of discrimination on white people. You can't do that. Caucasians, you can't. And contemporary racism is something that has been in the making for centuries and decades, as it ties back to colonialism, it ties back to slavery. And for something that is as well established as it is, that puts white people at the top of the chain and at the top and main beneficiaries of racism and privilege, they cannot experience reverse racism. but racial prejudice, absolutely. So distinguish the two, racial prejudice and racism.
Perhaps I can also explain like how I see this, because this is a question, and every time I hear it, it's like it's always just difficult to, like, at least for me, to unpack. And I have a note here, just a small quote I got from a writer called Zebablé, and she talks about that reverse racism is a card that is often pulled by white people when people of color call out racism and discrimination or create spaces for themselves that say white people are not a part of. So the rationale and the need to identify this as reverse racism is usually based on a desire to prove that people of color don't have it that bad, that they are not the only ones who are at a disadvantage or targeted because of their race. So based on that, we also have to understand that reverse racism is a myth because it tends to ignore the dynamics of power, as Rawa says, and the privilege between individuals and group. So reverse racism is not factual because it assumes that racism occurs on a level playing field, whereas in fact it doesn't. So for clarity, again, racial prejudice absolutely exists, can be upheld and perpetuated by Black people and people of color. So there's some assertions and stereotypes about white people, for example, like when people say white people can't dance or white people don't spice their food. These stereotypes can also be as light as this or as heavy and harmful towards racial prejudice against white people. But it's not quite the same as racism because it lacks that power angle. In the presentation earlier, I talked about, racial prejudice being discriminatory or derogatory attitudes based on assumptions from perceptions about race and skin color. So while we can direct racial prejudice towards white people, it is not considered racism because of that power dynamics. I think also just worth saying that racial prejudice and power together tends to lead to harmful discrimination and oppression against people or groups and individuals as well. So racism really doesn't have much to do with our feelings. Racism can be measured. It is a reality that white people in some sense are not subject to, regardless of their income status or their socioeconomic background, for example. And this is an argument I think a scholar called Harriot also made, I think, in 2018 as well.
If I can add something before we go on to the next one, I just thought you said something about level playing field, and it goes back to the definition power of who is what. And we don't have that definition power. But then I also remembered one thing, and it's that I often say racism racism is innovative. It's not static because it has things have happened, progress happens, and then something new is found to draw us back, like erasure of history, erasure of what was done, distortion of who these, for example, prominent figures of activism were and their history and just all of that. And as an example, I can use Black people are free of slavery, then they find new ways of discriminating them. Or here actually, about a year ago, there was a campaign that was done by a group of different organizations to put a system in for police, the police profiling, where police, whenever they stop people, that they would give out a receipt for stopping them. And after many years, within the parliament, finally there was an agreement that the government did put aside some money, and they actually did send it to the Justice Committee. And after working on it, they came back with, of course, this is very important, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to find a loophole onto how we're going to sabotage that very thing that we said we're going to try and implement. And that was, well, each time people are stopped and given receipt, then the other person needs to consent, well, not consent, like they need to be registered. When really all you need to do is register the ID number of the police. You don't need it you don't need it to a person, that specific person that's being stopped. But we know that generally people of color don't really have a lot of trust towards the police. And it also kind of puts you in a position where you're afraid to give out your information. So I think that's a really bad loophole because it kind of like draws back the type of progress that we can do. And I think that's innovation. So there are many other examples, but I think it's very important for me to actually use Norwegian examples so that we remember where we find ourselves. So.
Thank you for that. And thanks everybody for comments and questions in the chat, and welcome. Feel free to just share. I'm going to move on. So I'd like to ask about how does racism show up? Because many people, me included, see or saw a racist as this hateful, violent, aggressive person, basically a member of Ku Klux Klan. But does it always have to be physically or explicitly violent?
I think we need to define violence. And yes, you know, I think when we think about racism, we think about watching for 7 or 8 minutes while a man has a knee to his neck, being murdered in broad daylight. We see racism as when people are shot, you know, when there's a loss of life, when there's a type of physical violence that leads to bleeding or something. I remember having a conversation with my partner, and he was saying that to him, this was years ago, to him, you know, like when I experienced racism, or when, you know, people of color we know experience racism, you know, like it's not really that bad in comparison to, say, like people who are shot on a basis of racism, or people who, you know, if it's not like physically violent. And I think maybe we need to just understand that violence comes in different forms. You know, sometimes we think this whole thing about microaggressions, you know, we think about micro when we kind of like coast on the micro aspect to mean it's small, but really it's macro in the effects that it has. Like we think of microaggressions as deaths by 1,000 cuts, you know, over and over again. You know, you get hit, you get cut, you get invalidated, you know, a slight is said. And for the people who are delivering that, you know, it's something small, right? But for you, who you're the receiving end and who you've been receiving this for, say, 20 years, 30 years of your life, it becomes a really violent thing that not only has that physical impact, even though you're not bleeding, but also has a mental and a psychological impact on the way you experience the world. So I think racism is always violence. It just comes down to how we experience violence.
I think what you said about defining violence is very important. It also kind of shows you how racism is extremely dehumanizing, that you have to see a person being kneeled on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds so that you can feel like that person died of, you know, that person's death was caused by racism. It is extremely dehumanizing. I could just ask, like, what effect does experiencing microaggressions every day on you? Chisom, I'm pretty sure you'll say something about how you feel exhausted. You always are tense. You are always afraid for the next microaggressive event. And I think maybe subtle racism is a better term for it, because as you said, like, there's nothing micro about it. It's macro, because it does affect you. It does affect your daily life. Of course, for the person at the other end, it can be intentional or unintentional, but it doesn't really do you anything, does it? And also you can't call it out each time this happens, because then you have an entire day where you have to call out nearly everyone that you meet, because there's always something. But if you think about how racism affects people, the emotional damage and the effect on mental health, it's monumental. It's, depression, anxiety, sometimes low self-esteem. You go about the physical, then you have people are more prone to high blood pressure, because it's extremely, things happen to your body. People turn to alcoholism. We see that it's quite prevalent, for example, in indigenous populations. You have death by suicide, violence, or negligence. And you also suffer on a financial basis, and you're isolated and you have low trust in others. How is that not violence?
I think as well, Rahel, like just thinking about it from like, I'm just trying to like internalize this conversation and think about like how it affects me. And just to be clear, I am a woman who has a potload of privilege, and I'm fully aware of that privilege, but I'm also fully aware about like the ridiculous things I have to worry about, like leaving my house every single day, planning a vacation, right? If I when I'm planning a vacation, sometimes with my white friends, they're thinking about something else. I'm thinking about, is this an area that I can actually go to and be safe? Let me look up information here. If there's anything online that I need to prepare myself for, I'm thinking about, I'm not thinking about, what bikini do I want to wear on this trip? That is like points 50 or 60 on my list, because first I have to prepare myself from possible harm when I'm traveling in a lot of Western countries. And these are thoughts that my partner who is white never has to think about. My friends, who are white, for example, never have to think about. And it's not something that should lead to shame or guilt. It's just saying like, this is a fact for how racism affects the body and the mind. It is about, it is, chances are when I'm in situations that a microaggression happens, but have I gone on vacation where I did not experience a single thing? Absolutely. But the fact that I have to think about it and prepare myself and guard myself against it, it is exhausting, So I think like it shows up in different ways. And I think that is what is important to understand, and how over time it becomes violence and the body keeps score and the body remembers. And it's like a subconscious thing that we do to continuously protect ourselves.
Yeah, I have a question. Eva, how often are you aware of your, so-called race?
No, I'm not.
How often are you aware, Chisel? You're mute.
You're muted, Chisel.
Yeah, basically just saying often. I think the only time I really feel like properly free is like when I'm on an African, like on the continent in an African country, where I really, and that's when I understand the difference. So just to clarify that, I feel like I understand both sides, how I exist as a person of color in the West and how I exist as a person of color in, say, Nigeria or Ghana, where I don't have to do that thinking process. I don't have to plan. I don't have to wear an armor to protect myself for potential microaggressions, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. But also, I think it's very important to talk about not only the physical, but the financial, the social and emotional parts of the racial violence that people experience. But people don't see it as violence. But if you're not safe and you're disadvantaged in all aspects of life, that's still violence. Because it's not due to you not trying hard enough. It's just due to you being disadvantaged in many areas, despite having some privileges.
Right. I think there's also perhaps like a risk in, at least for me as a mother, figuring out that dance where I don't want to impose unnecessary fear on my child. How do I raise her to be aware, to have the language to protect herself? Because, hey, information is power. Pretending like it doesn't exist or will not happen is risky, and it is harmful to, say, children of color, for example. But it's that fine dance as to, I want to protect her, but I also don't want her to give her something to, to think about. And I think just that process is also quite, for me, emotionally violent, just like rationalizing the fears I have about our child versus the fears my partner has or doesn't have about our child.
Thank you, both of you. I mean, thank you for sharing all of this, because I can say as a white person, I have no idea. This is so important to know. And thank you everybody who shared in the chat, because this is how we also learn. So thank you for that so much. Okay, we will move on. So how do people of color facilitate forms of racism and uphold white supremacy?
Two things that come to mind, I think we kind of maybe already talked on, is colorism and anti-Blackness. So just to define what colorism is is discrimination based on skin color. You can also call it like shadism. So, for example, it is a form of privilege in which people who share similar ethnic traits. So you can say, for example, Rahul and myself, and you can call us Black women, but within our ethnic, our racial group, we can see that Rahul and I have different shades. We look differently on the basis of our color in a way, right? I think it's also important to note that unlike racial bias, which is usually perpetrated by individuals of one race against another, colorism is actually frequently observed among members of the same ethnic or racial group. So you can see colorism show up within Black spaces where we compare, okay, who's lighter and what benefits do you have on a cultural and societal basis, on the basis of the lighter skin color that you have and that proximity to whiteness. Another one that comes to mind is anti-Blackness. And there's a quote by James Baldwin, who I love, I think it says, the reason people think it is important to be white is that they think it is not important to be Black, or something like this, and I think that manifests in a lot of Black spaces through bleaching of the skin. Literally Black people bleach their skin, and also some South Asian people also bleach their skin so they can be closer to whiteness because of the benefits inherent within their society of their skin color. If you're lighter skinned, you might have more privileges, you might have more access, you might be perceived as more beautiful. And in some cases, that also gives you status on a socio-economic level. So those are the two things that come to mind. Rahul, is there something you want to add here?
Yeah, I want to talk about a certain politician in Norway who is a person of color. And this is a whole story about anti-Blackness. Just to give you a context. I think a couple of years ago or something, some comedian, I think their episodes were canceled or something. And please don't think about cancel culture. It's not a thing. The people who get canceled are usually very powerful, and you cannot cancel power, but that's a whole different story. Anyways, yeah, because he used blackface, this comedian. And when it got canceled, this politician took it upon himself to write an op-ed about how Norway doesn't have a history of racism, and that this is cancel culture, and that this is something that we're just, let's just put it this way, like more or less he said that people are being snowflakes. In no context is ever blackface okay. It doesn't matter what your history is. And I did say earlier today that we do have a lot of racist history in Norway, but still, in no context is it okay. Anyways, there came some criticisms about, and I could just say, like, this person that was doing it, it was to appease, the middle class white people that, like to call themselves progressives, but think that things have gone too far. That's basically what he was doing. But by doing so, what he did was he practiced anti-Blackness, and he undermined something that actually he has nothing to do with, and it hurts Black people. So when somebody called him out for doing that, he then played victim and said, I thought we were done with racial classifications. Some radical or Black organization tried to silence me, blah, blah, blah. He's in parliament now, so it worked clearly. But just saying that this is the type of things that people of color can do to uphold and reinforce racism. And that they do by actually just stepping on Black people. And this is also why I say not everybody can be racist. But yeah, I think like it's always great to think about how we internalize the structural and institutional racism, and we reinforce that practice. Yeah, I think Chisom has covered most of it.
Yeah, I think it's also maybe also words like acknowledging where we benefit. I think for me, that's where a lot of my anti-racist work like started, is just looking internally and saying like, yo, Chisom, where do you benefit from this? I know that say in some spaces, I benefit from not being the darkest Black person in the world. And I know that, right? I also benefit from, like when my hair is not braided, I have a lot of hair. I think it's glorious, and other people think so too. But I also know that that gives me some level of power. And then reflecting on situations like years ago where I have used, that proximity or the way my hair is perceived to my benefit. Like I started with the shame and the guilt, and then luckily moved away from that to acknowledge that, okay, this is something I'm aware of. And how can I ensure that when I'm in a space and somebody says, oh, Chisom doesn't really have issues about her hair because her hair falls this way, that I'm not like, yeah, absolutely. That I'm actually able to speak up and say, this is just my experience, but a significant number of people have a completely different experience with Afro hair, for example, or have a different experience because of the darker shade of their skin in comparison to mine. And I think this is where, as people of color, as Black people, we also harm each other by not speaking truth to ourselves or speaking truth to power when we have the opportunity to do so.
If I can add one more thing, the model minority thing. That's one very common way of reinforcing racism as a person of color. When there are a lot of people who, like, for example, being the only Black person in the room, where they're not radical, but like they give some sort of legitimacy for to the group of people that you're being around. Well, you're educated, so you're better than the others. You have done X, so you're better than the others, but then you appease whiteness. And also this is, again, I'm going to go back to anti-Blackness. I'm going to keep talking about this. This is something that, of course, Black people also do, but this is like that whole thing with the proximity to whiteness and like that being in between white and Black also really plays out. So that imagination that one is better than the other, that inherently better than the other, that's something that has also been systematically ingrained in different groups of people through colonialism and how whiteness systematized, or imperialism systematized that system of hierarchy. So model minority also stems from that, in addition to colorism and all of that.
I think that sometimes as well, when people of color benefit from that, they might not consciously recognize that. You know, for the longest time, I grew up in the US, right? So like I had my formative years in the US. And for the longest time, I would always say jokingly, but subconsciously, I think seriously, that I was white acceptable because, you know, I went to white schools. I was in boarding school. A lot of my friends were white. And it took me years to unpack what that meant for myself, you know, and then when it finally hit me, you know, it was, I felt really angry with myself for a while. And then I started unpacking what that meant in terms of privilege and the access and the opportunities that I have been afforded. So I think even within, oftentimes when we talk about racism and when we talk about, say, colorism or anti-Blackness, I think oftentimes it's quite easy to just think, again, that it's a white Black problem. But I think we all have to think about it. We all have to think about the ways in which we benefit. And we need to start with ourselves. Like, it's easy to say that group, that people, you know, the middle-aged white man, right? But really, we need to start with ourselves and look internally and start unpacking from there. Eva.
Mm-hmm. Whew, I could listen to you and listen. Thank you for sharing, Chisom and Rahua, and Gaia also, thank you for sharing. So now I would like to touch upon anti-racism. As Chisom already mentioned at the end of her presentation, Angela Davis said, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So why is it not enough to be a non-racist?
My experience, the people who've harmed me a lot have been non-racists, right? Like I think you can be non-racist and watch somebody die. You can be non-racist and not speak up for something that matters. I think non-racism is comfortable for you, for me. It doesn't help somebody else. It doesn't address systemic and structural and interpersonal challenges and problems that people save. Non-racist is not speaking up where you can, not using your power where you can. Non-racist is saying, I have a Black friend, or I have an Indian friend, or it's, you know, like a Chinese friend, so I'm good. You know, I don't practice anti-Asian hate. And when it's time to post up a hashtag, I'm happy to share and post up that hashtag. But it doesn't create any type of measurable change or impact. You know, I have had conversations with people, even people in my family who are white, who have said things like, oh my gosh, I can't believe there are still racists in the world. And then in the next breath, they're saying something that is racist, you know, and I think not understanding or acknowledging that being a non-racist is sometimes harmful, is harmful. But I do think we all have to begin somewhere. You know, like I'd rather take my chance with like a non-racist than a racist, right? We all have to start somewhere, but we have to move away from not non-racist or not a racist, and we have to slowly figure out, how do we get to being an anti-racist? You know, like if the conversations around racism still make you uncomfortable, if they make you feel fragile, if they make you feel blame, shame, guilt, it's a really great place to start. And how do we move away from that into, you know, what can we actually do? If you remember the diagram, you know, how do we learn? How do we grow? How do we become better? Right?
Yeah, I think if you keep on benefiting from the privileges you are afforded purely by the virtue of your color, then you're actually contributing to racism, which makes you not even a non-racist, it makes you a racist. So anti-racism, I think, is now a catchphrase where a lot of people like throwing it around and saying that they're anti-racist or they oppose racism. But in terms of actions, we have to see, I feel like it's not only do you have to be anti-racist, you even have to be an abolitionist. I think it's very important. And I came across this thing that I had completely forgotten today. And it's the quote is, he says, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humankind. This is by Noel Ignatieff, who is a labor activist and also works to abolish whiteness. And this other anthropologist who's called Barner Hess did a ethnography of whiteness, which is basically 1 to 8, and 1 where like there's a white supremacist, and then 8 where you're, well, basically a good ally or the person that you're supposed to be, ideally. But he puts most white people or most white allies at 4 and 5, where he calls them white confessional. So you're sympathetic to a set of issues, but you're only sympathetic to those issues privately. You're not going to speak up when something happens and you see it, because it might hurt you, it might hurt your privilege, and it might somehow, isolate you from the group that is basically benefiting from racism. Meanwhile, true allyship is, I'm not going to use that phrase because I think a lot of people are going to be very uncomfortable with it, but those who refuse complicity, or at 7 and 8, name what's going on and have intention to subvert white supremacy and white authority, and tell the truth at whatever cost. That means possibly losing your privilege. And at the 8th, he has that word is, I'm really having trouble saying it, abolitionist, wants to change the institutions and dismantle whiteness, and not allowing whiteness to reassert itself. And so I think it's, if you want to be an anti-racist, which you should be, because if you're an anti-racist, you're doing it for yourself as well. And are you, I really don't know what else I can say about this, but I think giving up your privilege, I actually don't think that, I have a problem with people using their privilege. If you're using your privilege, you're still using it or somehow benefiting from it. So I think it's very important that, yes, you speak up if I'm not in the room. If I'm uncomfortable speaking up, speak up in solidarity with me. But make sure that that's something that's, I don't want to do before you do it, if I'm in the room. It's very important that you understand that sometimes being an anti-racist or being an ally is also keeping quiet and rather just stepping away and not centering yourself.
I think of like active allyship, like one of the ways, I mean, so we talk about allies, and of course there's a move from just talking about allyship to active allyship, because it's an active state of being and it requires action. And for those of us who want to be a bit more radical, think about it as being an accomplice, right? If you're an accomplice, you have something to lose. Oftentimes we think about allyship or showing up when we have nothing to lose. I mean, it's really easy to show up for anything when you have nothing to lose. What is hard is showing up when you have something to lose. And that could be popularity, that could be privilege, that could be power, that could be, anything. And I think it's quite important to understand that we can all be allies. Like in my own way, I can be allies to many groups of people. I can be allies to white people. I can be allies to gay people, to trans people, to my team. Like there's so many ways I can show up, right? And even when it means that I have something to lose, I think I hope we're going to talk about the conversation around like the discomforts that comes with having these conversations like in a bit. But I really think that, at least for me, how I practice my form of active allyship is to think of myself as accomplice. If we're going to get arrested, it's going to be you and me in that jail, because that for me is important for how I show up.
Yeah, you have to risk something. But also one more thing, this is very, very important if you're going to be an ally, make sure that you can take criticism with grace, and rather than, running to, being fragile about it and saying, no, that's not what I meant. Or something extremely important, it's okay to say, I don't know. You don't have to know to be an ally. Just make sure that you are showing solidarity, and also remember that showing solidarity to somebody is also showing empathy. So just criticism with grace and empathy, and knowing when you don't know something, just say, I don't know. Don't pretend to know. Don't also take up so much space for it just so that you can prove that you are an ally. You don't need to, because what you need to do is actually do something, show it in actions. Talking doesn't help me.
Okay. Whew. There's so much to take in. I believe the audience feels the same. Please, again, comment, ask questions. We're here. We have amazing speakers, Chisholm and Rahwa, and this is a chance for you to ask a question and see what they say. You can learn something, definitely. Okay, so I just want to tell to Chisholm and Rahwa that we have like 10 minutes before the Q&A, just to have that in mind. And let's move on. Okay. Oh my God, there are so many questions and so little time. But okay, you have talked about and touched on how the topic of racism and anti-racism and race in general makes people feel uncomfortable. And I know we talked about it here at Diversify with the team, and I also shared it makes me feel uncomfortable. So what do you think? Why do topics like these make us and make people uncomfortable?
Because it's uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable. I think for many of us, it comes with different layers of feelings. Yes, we did have a conversation with the team where I did ask, everyone, like, why, listening to conversations like this, why might they make us uncomfortable? And, some of the feedback I got was, because some people feel like they're not doing or learning enough. Some people realize that they still have racial bias and prejudice. Some people realize that they still benefit from systems and structures that were built for them and not for others. Some people talked about what if you unintentionally cause harm or do something wrong, and that makes them uncomfortable, thinking that they can always do more, and then this feeling of like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to know enough. I think somebody else talked about that we're never really prepared to hear about other people's challenges because it can be difficult. And also the need to distance oneself from, say, a group, an individual, that like a group you belong to. Say, for example, whiteness. One of the things that has been coming up for me recently is that a lot of people of color have grown up, have lived their lives, hearing that you're a Black person or you're a brown person based on the race, and they've accepted that terminology. But for white people, it's still quite uncomfortable to be called a white person, at least for some. So an example for this is, my partner who's white, right? When we first moved to Norway and we're getting to know people, when he'd go out and meet people, he'd always say, like, I met this Black guy today, and I met this Asian guy today, and I met this Indian guy today. But then when he met a white man, he just met a man. Or just met a woman. And then I had to ask him, like, why does everybody else need a label before? Because for him, he has consistently been the norm in the world, and he's never really used to hearing himself being defined. Now, being with me and like hanging out with all of my diverse friends, and sometimes, we say white man, inherently just made him uncomfortable because that he wasn't used to it. He was always just a man. He was never really a white man the way I am a Black woman, right? So that also makes people uncomfortable. I think it's also worth clarifying that for me, taking on these conversations is inherently uncomfortable. I wish I didn't have to do it. Like, I wish I didn't have to engage. There was a time in my life where I was coasting, sipping on pina coladas, not worried about things like this. But here I am, And I have to think about this. And my discomfort comes from, being perceived as, pardon my French, the shit stirrer, being perceived as the angry Black woman, being perceived as the person who sees a problem with everything and the person who's overly sensitive. And I don't want to be perceived like this. I don't want to be seen like this. But is my discomfort worth my daughter's future sanity? Because I keep reflecting on the fact that the way I'm raising my child, she's going to grow up one day and she's going to be like, Mommy, what the heck did you do? And I want to be able to say, hey, let me tell you how uncomfortable I was and how I did something anyway. So for me, even this conversation, like you can ask my team, like addressing anti-racism is so hard. And the conversations like Rahwa and I would have about this, like it's so difficult that we have to create a light version to have this conversation with you all today. So it's uncomfortable for all of us. It's also uncomfortable for me, but we have to push back past the discomfort, because otherwise we continue to get harmed. All right.
Well, you listed a lot of things here, but I think I'm going to start with the shit stirrer or angry Black woman. You don't have to be angry to be called angry if you're a Black woman. So you can just say this is not okay, and you don't have to have like any sort of tone. You're like, don't be angry. And as a person walking around, being a Black woman, there's nothing I can do about that, nor do I want to. But it's so difficult just saying anything, because that things are going to turn into a conflict if you say that something is not okay. But then you have to find a way to be comfortable with it. I have to find a way to be comfortable with it just as much as other people having these discussions have to be uncomfortable with it. Now, I said some things today that probably is going to strike a nerve with a lot of people. One of the things being that there is some sort of power struggle, let's call it that, because I don't have a better phrase for it, with people of color in general, as in like, okay, the global majority, between Black people and others that kind of like work to, and this is not everybody that does it, just to be clear. I'm not saying that everyone is like that, but I think when we're talking about people of color and other people of color and Black people, we're having that conversation, it's very important to note that this is something that has been in the works for a long time. We have it ingrained in our system, and there's all of this with the model minority, blah, blah, blah. I've said it already. It's uncomfortable for me to say. I don't like it, but we have to have that conversation, because we have to work together if we're going to change things. And unless we say things are not going to change. We have to talk about them loud and I would say proud, but we can't. It's very uncomfortable in the beginning, and it will never get comfortable either, because you'll always learn something new. There's always, the more you pick things apart, the more you're going to find problems. So it's going to be, the more conscious you are, the more things that you're going to see a problem with. And when you do that, then you have to keep being uncomfortable and have that conversation, and also just make sure that it's not personal. Like, understand that it's not personal. It is, you're a human being, you can make mistakes, that's fine. Like I said, it's okay not to know things, because, well, no one is born knowing everything. It's just that the people of the global majority, we have the advantage of knowing, I'm going to call it the advantage, knowing some things, because we have to deal with the crappy things. That's it. So just another problem that I think people have is like the feeling of being blamed or framed within a certain context. Like Chisom, you mentioned the need to distance oneself from things that, I think you mentioned it, no? From things like when, let's say, a white person commits terrorism versus when non-white person committing terrorism, two different labels that we get. There's that. So it's like, with a lot of Norwegians, my experience, for example, is that, yeah, something must be, he must be sick in the head, or that's not what.
By the way.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that commits terrorism must be sick in the head, because it has nothing to do with the ideology. Of course, it has ideology behind it, but like, for example, when we talk about, brown people, we would always associate it automatically with a religion, which is so problematic. How do you insult an entire, billion plus people by the act of one person? It's so problematic. But when it comes to white person doing that, but like something must be wrong with him. The head is not okay. Norwegians are not like that. So you have to, not only do you have to distance yourself as an individual, you have to distance an entire nation. And that's when I think like that white identity kicks in, really, which is something that's very problematic. And another thing, I think I forgot to mention the media. Media is one of like the most important things in the system that reproduces and reinforces racism. It dehumanizes people of color. I'm going to ask you, when was the last time you saw a dead body that is white? And then I'm going to ask you, when was the last time you saw a dead body that is brown or black? Think about it, and just keep it in your mind next time you're sitting and watching the news. We contribute to dehumanizing people of color. The way the narratives are done by the media, anything, how often, like you look at something, a terrorism committed that hurt white people, it's on the news for weeks. Terrorism committed by a white person where brown people or black people were killed, maybe. Christchurch, it wasn't even on the front page the day after on one of the newspapers, which was very shocking to me. So just think about how the media also does it. So I think the media is also going to need to get comfortable talking about things like this. Not only op-eds, but also journalists also have to be very open and talk about their discomfort, but also talk about the problems and call them out as they are.
I see somebody here just has said something about it's most of the time not called terrorism when the person is white. And I have to agree with that, because recently, I think last year, an act of terrorism was committed against the LGBTQ community here in Oslo, and people were murdered. And I have to say, like, in my family, a particular person who also is shocked that people are racist, when we heard of this news, and we are all reeling from it, because we what's it called, we're planning to go to the march the day after. Before we found out the ethnicity of the person, it was just assumed that they were Norwegian, and the answer then was like, yeah, they have to have a mental illness, something has to be wrong, and this is ableist. But anyways, let's not even go there. And the minute it was announced that this person was Iranian, Norwegian, it was like, oh, those people, of course, they are filled with so much hate. And I'm just like, why the switch though? Like, why can't that person still have a mental illness? And so I think it's really important that we also, introspect, because I do want to say this person in my family, they're a really good person. And, I care for them a lot. But it's also important that we're able to internalize and introspect even of the unconscious biases that we hold, because, they make a huge difference in how we interpret the world and the outcomes it has for people. Just mindful of the time here. So I guess I'm going to give the word to Eva.
Can I just say one thing very quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, keep in mind that everyone has privilege, but then also that privilege, the fact that you have privilege doesn't make your experiences of difficult experiences or discrimination or whatever any less than what it is. So I'll circle back to what Chisom said in the beginning about Oppression Olympics. My experience doesn't make your experience any less than what it is, and how it impacts you, it doesn't change it. It just means that our experiences are different, and some things are in place that make it very difficult for me to move past that. That's the difference.
Oh, thank you, ladies, for sharing. Okay, so we are supposed to end this part of, although I have a lot of questions, I have to say 2 hours is not enough. It's going too quickly. We have to end this part, the conversational part, and enter into Q&A. But before we do, now we also have some poll questions for you, not too many. So yes, can we have a first poll question? Okay. It's been worked on, it's coming. Do you think you are a racist? Now, after you've heard the whole conversation. Okay. The answers are slowing down. Okay, this is interesting. The I don't know part definitely is smaller, right? Chisholm Rahwa. You are muted. Chisholm.
Yeah, I'm saying that's good. It's good. It's nice to see the difference afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you so much
Then
for
we
sharing.
have 34% at yes and 55% at no and 11% at I don't know.
Yes.
And it's okay to not know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another one, right? Okay. Hit us, I mean, Miguel. Oh, did I turn it off? Oh.
No, so it's going. The next question is, do you think you're anti-racist? And yeah, we have the poll going.
I closed it. I thought it was the previous question, so I closed I don't see the poll, unfortunately.
Eva, I still see it. It's still
okay.
working.
Okay. Okay. No, I closed it for myself. So
Okay.
now Miguel told me how to reopen. Thank you.
All right.
I love this. Look how much of yes we have.
So we have 62% as a yes, 21% as a no, and 17% as I don't know. Thank you all for participating. It's good to see also the difference before and afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you all. And thank you all for your comments and questions. We are going to now ask our speakers the questions that you posted. So first question is to Rahwa from Chugo. Systematically erasing or washing history has been an issue, and the proclaimed reason is to protect future generations from either feeling oppressed, upset, or inciting them to violence. What methods do we have to protect and pass down history without rehashing a painful past?
I guess we have to try to answer these questions quickly because we have a couple of them and we don't have a lot of time. So
yeah, Chugo, we can talk later as well, but I can just say that facts are facts, and without, like I said in the beginning, if we cannot address history, we cannot address what's happening today, because everything is a result of a byproduct of history. What methods we have to protect and pass down history? Well, let's not do trauma porn. Let's try and communicate the facts of what was done wrong, what was done to people. We don't have to paint pictures of how it was done, but it's important nonetheless. And erasure is the only thing. It's like, sweeping things under the carpet, erasing things. So it's yeah, I think it's we just have to make sure that the schools and us ourselves have to teach our children history and how it has affected people. And since the schools are not doing it, I think we have to do it on a policy level. We have to work on a policy level.
Thank you, Rahwa. Chisom, do you maybe have something to add, or should I move on?
Move on.
Okay, so the next question is from Emil. Why is to both of you. Why do you think people, employers, managers, colleagues, feel threatened by employees from the global majority forming close friendships with one another in the workplace?
I can't speak for people. I can't speak for employers, but I do think that there is a level of fragility that is that is baked in there. I think also because the gravity of racism and discrimination is not properly understood. I see a lot of employers talk about like, we want it to be psychologically safe, but we're not actually doing anything to make it psychologically safe. Like they almost thinking, sorry, someone just entered the room called your worst nightmare. So I'm not sure if we should let them.
I was also looking at that.
But I think I think sometimes people think that by just talking about psychological safety and talking about the feelings of inclusion, that people should automatically feel included. So when they see groups of people, say, forming ERGs, so employee resource groups or affinity groups, or becoming close friends, they think, oh, but, I'm an ally and you should include me, because there is also this sense of white centering and white fragility that is involved, is thinking about yourself and not thinking about the people and the spaces that they need. The reality is, if I work in a predominantly white space, or if a person in the LGBTQ community works in a predominantly heteronormative space, it's really a lot of work to get them to the point where they feel psychologically safe, and that needs to be supported with actions and policies and frameworks and systems. So I think that feeling of, say, being threatened or being uncomfortable comes from white fragility and white centering, and that should not be the case.
You're on mute.
Okay, sorry. I said thank you, Chisom. The next question is to you. Please deconstruct, throw more light on this statement. Do not be colorblind, be color brave. Right or wrong?
So I have a problem with blind in that question. Again, it's ableist, so I don't think we should say that. But in terms of being color brave, I understand the sentiments behind it. One of the things I say to people who are just like, oh, but Chisom, I don't see your color. You're just Chisom to me. Like, please see my color. There's nothing wrong with seeing my color. See this beautiful brown skin and celebrate it, but also acknowledge, areas where we have inequities, areas where you have more power, areas where I might also have more power than you. So instead of moving away, like saying, I see color, was the thing Rahwa said to me yesterday about the thing Trevor Noah said, that for people who say they don't see color, how the heck do you drive? How do you know when it's green, and how do you know when it's yellow, and when do you know when it's red to stop? So what do you mean by you don't see color? Is it by denying the reality that you don't see me different from Eva? Just on the basis of like how we appear on our color. So instead of like running away from like, oh, but I don't see color, how about you embrace, hey, Chisom, I see you. Hey, Eva, I see you. Hey, person from a South Asian country, I see you as you are, and I celebrate you as you are. So absolutely, I don't think it's about being brave, just be decent and just state the fact and the truth. You see what you see. We understand the sentiment, but that sentiment can be harmful.
I'm sorry to say, but it's a little condescending to say be color brave. You see it anyway. So you said something about see. I'm sorry, like I have to jump in. It's not to me the question, but
No.
you know, you
Please.
say you wouldn't say I'm colorblind if you didn't see my color. Let's just put it this way. Yeah. So you see my color. So why are we pretending that we don't see it when you have to mention that you don't see my color? And also, do you have to not see my color to acknowledge that I am, you know, all the things that you say I am? It's yeah.
There is this feeling in the people of a global minority that they are actually doing a nice thing and not realizing that they're basically canceling part of the identity of people. So I see, Chisholm, you wanted to say something.
No, I'm mindful of time, so I'm just gonna move. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the next question. So it starts with, on the other hand, so I'm not sure what was the first hand, but let's see what the question is. On the other hand, could you say a word about the victim mentality? Instances where racial minorities potentially use the fact that we do live in a racialized, racist society as a reason why they are behind or not progressing. Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I think I do. So basically saying that because we live in a racialized society, that people of color might use that and be in victim mode and not like work hard. I mean, there's a part of me that kind of just want to say, on one hand, that it's a myth, but I think it needs to be nuanced as well. I think as people, we need to understand the impact that discrimination has on us, and the fact that I can rise above that level of discrimination and own businesses and be successful doesn't necessarily make me better than the person who struggles with it. So think about mental health. The fact that I am a high functioning person with a anxiety disorder doesn't mean that the person who cannot function is a victim or more of a victim than myself. I think we're just dealt the cards that were dealt. It is possible that sometimes because of experience that you have endured, that you are unwilling to try anymore. You know, like there are people, say, for example, if something traumatizing or traumatic happens to you outside, you lock yourself in the house and you don't want to go out, or you don't want to apply for work, or you don't want to do this. It's possible, but I'm just really mindful of categorizing all of it as people of color being lazy and not wanting to work. I think each occurrence needs to be looked at on a contextual and case-by-case basis of what hindrances they face, right? Because we all have different abilities in the world. And while some of us can like take a bullet and keep going, other people who want to take a bullet and just like, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to take it anymore. I'm tired, right? So I think it just needs more nuance. So I can't really speak to that in an unequivocal manner.
Can I very quickly jump in? I can't really say about the mentality because I don't know enough about it, but what I can say is just think about, for example, two people in the same class economically, one POC, another white. While they have the same access to financial and let's call it let's keep it financial access. The white person has a head start, and people think, you know, that there's a saying that you have to work twice as hard for half as much. It is based on what experiences that people have, like that thing about people being called lazy or perceived as lazy and all of that draws back to how people were categorized as even within the so-called science when they did the racial definitions. So that's why people feel like they have to work twice as hard, and often get passed on promotions, etc., etc., etc. So you have a head start, but I don't know about the victim mentality. I can't say, but just keep that in mind, though.
Okay. Thank you, Rahul and Chisom. So next question is from Stephanie. And after that is also Madeleine. They have kind of a similar question. So Stephanie is asking, do you or others here have recommendations for further anti-racist self-education?
I mean, there are a lot of books on there are a whole lot of books. So if you want to, you can start with Ibram Kendi. You can read works from Angela Davis. You can read White Fragility. You can read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. You can read a new book by Sarah Ra on white women, what you already know about your racism and what you can do about their books and books and books. From a workplace perspective, hey, reach out to us at Diversify. We run a lot of sessions and workshops around anti-racism within a workplace context and how you can do better. So yes, resources plenty, and maybe what we can do in following up because everyone who what's it called, signed up for this will receive the recording afterwards. We can try to add some book recommendations, but there are a lot of books. Also, there's one by Elizabeth Lieber on I'm Not Yelling, really great book as well, to understand different perspectives, like perspective of Black women in the workplace. So yeah, we can send you some recommendations. Otherwise, come talk to us.
Chisom, are we also going to share your presentation with the participants, or that will not?
Isn't it just like automatically in the recording? Yeah.
It's in the recording. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to make sure because I got a question about it. Thank you, Chisom. Rahul, do you have anything to add?
About books, I'll just give you the, if you want to read about the construction of race, look up The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. That's a really good book. It just draws back to history a little, like not far enough, but far. Yeah, I think, like Chisom mentioned most of them. I think anything by Audre Lorde is very important to read. Lola Olufemi, Mina Salami was also Scandinavian. Yeah, I think I'll just send a list.
Thanks, Rahul. I see here Mia also said that Me and White Supremacy is also a good book.
Right.
So we have another tip. Okay, so what Madeleine asked is, how can we practice anti-racism within the workspace, especially with a predominantly white workplace, within a predominantly white workplace?
So I think there are many ways. And I think that from a workplace context, you always have to meet the company and the people where they are. So in our consulting work, for example, with a lot of workplaces, I would never, without understanding your workplace, the dynamics, the setup, tell you like, hey, here is something you need to do. So we need to understand what and I think also just starting from, if it's a predominantly white workspace, what are some of the intentions to diversify it a little bit? And if there is a hiring freeze, for example, given the economic climate, where are some of the challenges internally, and how do you want to do better in that regard? And the fact that you are a predominantly white space, for example, does not necessarily mean that your audience, your customers, your clients are predominantly white. So if you don't have the competence and the capacity to actually create product solutions that are inclusive of every single person beyond like the immediate clients you think about, then that is also problematic. So it comes down to really just thinking about it from a case-by-case basis. There are ways, of course, that are universally acceptable, but I'd have to look at the company and then go from there.
Okay, so we have 6 minutes. I think we can ask one more question, but you have to be really quick. Oh my God, which question can be actually answered in 6 minutes? That's not possible. Okay, so I have one. Okay, try this. White fragility, white centering, and white tears. What are these, and how do they uphold white supremacy and detract from anti-racism? Let's go with a bang.
I'm just
that's
like
a kind of worms.
Yeah, like there's a lot. It's like it's
I know.
we don't have enough time for it. I can't say, but I think we can try. I can say that oftentimes, at least in my personal experience, if we take away the people who identify strictly as racist, like the KKK, for example, white fragility, white centering, white tears is usually perpetuated and upheld by allies. So the good white people, the people who believe that they are doing the work. So when they are called out or called in, they take it incredibly personal. So if you do something and I say, Eva, this is not okay, you center your whiteness, but I'm a good person. But, I'm trying, I'm doing my best, I'm showing up, I'm a self-described anti-racist, right? And you have hurt my feelings. And when things get heated, for example, what happens is that oftentimes white people in this situation, they cry, especially white women. They cry because it's overwhelming for them. And what happens when you cry is naturally you expect me to come say, oh, Eva, I'm sorry, oh, calm down. So it becomes about you, not about the problem. And it centers your pains, your fragility, your tears, and detracts from the actual problem or actual conversation at hand. So it's really hard to unpack, but I think it's when people who are actively doing the work on anti-racism, or they think they are, center themselves, center their experiences, center their feelings over the problem. And this is incredibly harmful. That discomfort you feel is incredibly harmful when it's centered, as opposed to sitting with it and saying, I don't know what I don't know. And leaning into that and trying to learn and unlearn what you think you know, because the problem is when people start thinking they've done the work or they're doing the work, so they know. You don't know what you don't know, and you need to accept that. Rahwa?
I think you said the most important points. Just don't center yourself, because if you cry, I have to do the work to protect your feelings. And usually conversations about race are had around white people's feelings, which is never something that we should do. And the reason we do that is because of white fragility, white centering, and what was the third one?
White tears.
White tears.
White tears. Yeah. So it's this is why we do that, and that in itself is contributing to us not having that conversation to protect somebody's feelings, which just reproduces the same problem. If we don't have these conversations, we're not going to get anywhere.
I really recommend reading White Fragility, because I feel like white fragility, white tears, and white centering can be like a whole conversation on its own. So I really recommend reading like White Fragility, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Those are some really good books to get you to start doing that work. And especially for those of us who think that we are non-racist or anti-racist, like just really start there, because that work is for all of us.
Yeah.
Yes,
and also
I would
please
like.
Stop saying. I'm sorry. Please stop saying that. Yeah, you and I are both women. Can't we just, that thing? that feminists do, don't do that, because that's why we talk about intersectionality all of the time. Just acknowledge that there are some things that kind of like classify people into like in many, many different groups. And sometimes there are different reasons to why people are being discriminated. And within, say, for example, so-called safer spaces, people can still be discriminated. So just listen and be willing to, what do you call it?
Unlearn.
Not just unlearn, but also receive the feedback. It's very important to do that.
Right. Okay, what time?
Thank you so much. And this can also be an answer to Stephanie and Madeline's questions, like, how to be anti-racist and how to do the work at the workplace or self-educate. Like, read all those books, learn the perspective, because those are the things, like, you don't know what you don't know. I cannot know those perspectives because they're not my experiences and will never be. So to get a perspective of people of global majority, read those books. Yes. Oh my God. Are there any last thoughts or words, Chisholm or Rahua, you would like to say to everyone?
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for being here, Rahua. Thanks, Eva, for moderating. Thanks, everyone, for joining and staying on. And I think the Diversify team for, all the work behind. I think like this conversation exhausts me a little bit, like, just to be honest. I think I need to like recover from it. And that, I think it's just part of doing the work. And I think like I need to recover from it, knowing fully well that I've not even said a quarter of the things that I would normally say if I was talking in a space that I felt absolutely safe in, and that also comes with its own baggage. So yeah, but I'm really glad for the audience and just being able to do some of this work publicly. So thank you all. I really appreciate your time, especially in this day and age. It's 2 hours. It's a long time. So really appreciate it.